Hello and welcome to Round the Table, episode 45, from the Meeting Point, broadcasting not only to Bilbao, but of course throughout the world. And this week's topic has been isolation, what it would be like to live alone, or what it would be like to live in a very small enclosed community, such as being away on long voyages on a fishing boat, or living on an oil rig, or living in a very isolated community up in the mountains with only a few neighbours. And of course the main topic of conversation this week was what it would be like to be stranded on a deserted island. But before we begin that, we should look at some what's the difference. So we have this word desert. Desert, a large area of sand with only one S. If you put two S's, you get the word dessert, which is a sweet dish that you eat at the end of the meal. The dessert. You notice that the stress moves from desert to dessert. Unfortunately, there is another word, dessert, with only one S. And this desert means something like abandon. So you might get a deserted village where nobody lives. Everybody has abandoned the village to go and live in the city. So you might get a deserted village. So when we talk about these tropical islands in the Robinson Crusoe scenario, they're often referred to as desert islands. But I think this must be a misnomer because they're really covered in jungle. They're not desert islands at all, but more accurately, they would be deserted islands, I think. I think they were misnamed somewhere in history. The next what the difference is the difference between isolated and insulated. A lot of people get confused with these two. If you live in an insulated house, it means that you have very thick walls, and you have double glazing on your windows so that the heat stays in the winter and the heat stays out in the summer. And also you can be noise insulated as well. If you live on a very noisy street and you don't want to listen to the traffic and the people drinking outside the bars, you might need insulation to keep the noise out. If you live in an isolated house, you would live up in the mountains where you have no neighbours. That would be isolated. So isolated is not the same as insulated. And another one that came up a lot this week, of course, was the difference between alone and lonely, which I'm sure we've discussed before. Alone is usually the physical state of not being with other people, whereas lonely is more emotional. So you can feel very lonely even when there are lots of people around you, which is often the truth, actually. We discovered during our conversations this week that people in larger communities are often more lonely than the people in the more isolated communities, which is a strange irony in this world. Some people do use alone and say, I feel alone, but really they mean lonely. Usually alone is the physical situation of not having other people with you, whereas lonely is more to do with the emotion, the feeling. Now let's have a look at the typical mistake for this week. It's another one we've seen many times. People often use during when they're talking about periods of time. It's much more likely in English to use the word for. So in this scenario that we were talking about of being stranded on a desert island, you would be stranded alone for 5 years. For 5 years, not during 5 years. When we use during, we tend to refer to a long period of time and when something happened inside the long period of time. So you might say, I woke up during the night. So the night is the long period of time. The amount of time you were awake is probably much shorter. You're not awake for the whole night. but you're referring to something happening within the longer period. If you say I worked in a bar during the summer, it doesn't mean that you worked in the bar for the complete summer. We're not specifying the period of time that you actually worked. So if you say I worked for 6 weeks, that would be the period of time. But if you worked during the summer, it only means that the period of time of you working was within the longer period of time of the summer. But how long you worked for, you haven't specified. Maybe you worked for 1 week during the summer, or just 1 day during the summer. Likewise, we often talk about during my childhood, or you can say during the 19th century, for example. So something happening within longer periods of time. Don't say you're stuck on an island during 5 years. You're stuck on the island for 5 years. Now it's time for a pronunciation problem. In the last few episodes, we've looked at the difference between the s and the z. S, z. What you do in your mouth is exactly the same. You have a s noise, and if you add the vibrations in your throat, if you go at the same time, you should get a z noise. Now, today we need to look at the f and the v. And it's the same thing. If you can go f, all you have to do is add the vibration and go v. And this is how you make the sound of the letter V. V. There's the F, and the V. V. So there is a difference between a ferry, which is a kind of boat, and very. Now, a lot of people, especially here in Bilbao, when they're trying to do the V, they often pronounce it as a B. It's not a B. So the word very is not the same as berry. Okay? So we've got 3 words here. Ferry with an F. Ferry. And then you have very with a V. Very. And then you have berry with a B. Berry. Ferry, very, berry. 3 different words. So now we have a sentence for you to practice. Let's see if you can do this. Victor had hoped to survive by saving berries and fishing for various fish. Although he was very brave, he had a feverish feeling and a fear of vicious wolves. So he valiantly built a fire in the valley, vowing to leave for the land he loved. Victor had hoped to survive by saving berries and fishing for various fish. Although he was very brave, he had a feverish feeling and a fear of vicious wolves. So he valiantly built a fire in the valley, vowing to leave for the land he loved. Of course, you'll never need to say that sentence in your life, but it's very good pronunciation practice. So for those of you that were not in the class this week, we were looking at this page, and the task that we had was to choose 3 of these objects that you can see here that would be useful to you if you had to survive for 5 years on a tropical desert island. So, first of all, most people eliminated the hat. We decided the hat was not at all useful because you can probably make your own hat from some leaves. Not many people wanted the gloves. That was not very interesting. The torch. Now, the torch is to help you see in the dark. This is not used for lighting fires. There are other torches that are kind of with fire on them. This is a torch with a light and a battery inside, so we decided that would not last very long. Now, the lighter appeared to be quite useful. The only question was, could you make the lighter last for the complete 5 years? And we decided that if you had the axe and you were very well organised, you could possibly light the fire once and keep it going for a very long time without it going out. It would take a lot of organisation, but we might be able to make that lighter last for 5 years. On the other hand, we do have a magnifying glass, which could be used for lighting fires, but only if we are on a tropical island with a lot of sun. If we're on any other type of island where we're not guaranteed sunshine every day, it might not be too useful for lighting fires, but it might be interesting if you want to study the insect life on the island. The needle and thread, people decided were not very useful. We're not going to worry about repairing our clothes for 5 years. And the Swiss Army knife, although in theory it has lots of useful tools on it, we're unlikely to need to open a bottle of wine or a can of beer or any tinned food. And the knife blade there is probably not big enough to be useful. And of course it has other tools, but none of them would last for 5 years. We thought it would probably break, so we're not impressed with Swiss Army knives. Now, the rope could be useful for climbing trees or making a shelter of some sort. String would also be useful for the same reason. The hooks and line might be useful for fishing, but if you've ever been fishing, you might find that you lose your hooks on the first day. So it might be possible, if you have a knife or the machete or axe, to make some sort of fishing basket, like one of those baskets that they used for catching crabs and lobsters. You might be able to construct something like that from plants on the island and use that for catching fish. Now, the cooking pot, people have decided, was very useful, not just for cooking but also for collecting water. And yes, we will have a water supply on the island. Nobody wanted the spade. A lot of questions about the difference between a spade and a shovel. A shovel tends to have little sides on it, so it's more useful for moving things, whereas a spade is really used for digging things, making holes in the ground. Nobody wanted to take the hammer and nails, so I think the consensus of opinion amongst the majority of people in the end was the lighter, the machete, and the cooking pot. That was the general agreement of the majority of people. Now, in this task, you are also allowed to take one luxury item, which tells us a lot about the people. In the past, we've had some very interesting responses to this one. Somebody once wanted to take a mirror, not for signalling to aircraft, but because he said it would be very difficult not being able to look at your reflection for 5 years, which was, it tells us a lot about the person in question, I think. For the majority of people, they were not impressed by that idea, because we're going to be looking a bit bad, I think. We're not going to be in the best condition to look at, so we'd rather not look at ourselves. Somebody once suggested perfume as a luxury item, so you could just smell it occasionally and have the smell of civilization. Unusual choice. One of the most popular ones this week was a mattress. Somebody suggested a mattress, which went down very well with the rest of the group. They all agreed this was a fine idea to take a mattress to sleep on. And then someone else extended that and decided that they wanted a complete bed, possibly inside a bedroom in a luxury bungalow with cooking facilities and everything. So we're not allowed all of that. That's not one luxury item. A fully equipped bungalow. That doesn't qualify, I'm afraid. Somebody else suggested a calendar because it might be useful to know exactly how long you had been on the island, which raised another question. as to whether you would know that you're going to be there 5 years at the beginning, because people decided that it would be quite a different thing if you started with the knowledge that you were going to be staying there for 5 years, or whether you just began and you didn't know when it was going to finish. People thought that would be quite a different scenario, which was an interesting idea. With regard to the books, now of course the normal response to the question of which 4 books would you like to take, everybody would like to take a survival handbook. Other people suggested they need a book on berries and plants and the uses of, so that they would know which plants they could eat, which ones were edible, as we say. Edible is the word for things you can eat, which would be a useful idea. And of course the Bible, the Holy Bible, as it's something that we always feel that we've never got round to reading it, but even for the non-religious people seem to think it would be an interesting thing to read, because so many of the stories are kind of in our culture, but we don't really know what the stories are about. So given 5 years and plenty of time to kill, we might read the Bible. And of course the other option is the complete works of Shakespeare. One very good idea that somebody had was to take the books, but actually blank books with nothing written in them at all. Just take books and a pencil and write all of your thoughts and keep a sort of a journal of everything that you've been doing. The idea was that it would be more interesting to write in the book than to read the book. And then on to the last part. If you were stranded with one person, who would you go with? And no, you're not allowed to take Ray Mears or Bear Grylls or any other survival expert from a TV program. You have to take somebody you know. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of the female members of our groups said that they would take their partner, which was rather nice. They were going to take their partner. However, most of the men decided to take a best friend rather than their partner, which is rather telling. And one of the main concerns that arose in a lot of the conversations was the possibility of surviving in the company of another person for 5 years. Now, this person you're going to take with you, you have to choose them very carefully, because you might not be able to put up with their conversation and their annoying habits. So the ability to get on with someone is probably far more important than their practical abilities in making shelters and catching wild animals for you. So you have to be very careful about who you take. And even then it was decided that you would still need your own personal time. Even stranded on an island with only one other person for company for 5 years, you would still feel the need to send them to the other end of the island occasionally to give you a bit of peace and quiet, which seems a strange irony, really. And other ironies of isolation that we came up with in conversation this week was that people who live in very isolated communities, in small villages out in the mountains or out in the country, don't feel the same sense of isolation as many people do who live in cities. And surveys have determined that there are a great many people who live in quite busy, crowded environments, but actually feel a great sense of loneliness and isolation. So you really must go around and visit your elderly neighbours, because it's often the elderly people in society that feel very isolated. One of the reasons being that a great many of their friends have slowly died off over the years, and they don't have a lot of contact with people. And also the physical ability of getting out the door and going out and meeting other people is just a challenge for a great many people. So it's a sad situation and a sad irony that we can be so isolated amongst this multitude of people. So that was our conversation this week on the theme of isolation. Next week we've got another one coming up on the topic of influence. Influence is next week. I'm sure it'll be a fascinating conversation as usual. Thank you to the people that came to the meeting point on Friday for our conversation on the Martin Luther King speech, part 2. We'll be doing it again next Friday for those of you that have missed out, so don't forget to book your seats. So all you meeting point people, I will see you during the week, and if you are listening and you're not a member of the meeting point, you will have to wait to next weekend, to the next episode of our podcast on the topic of influence. So have a good week. Till next week. Bye.